from your perspective, from traveling the world, understanding, Mossad and MI6, all these different countries and all these different intelligence gathering units, is there one country more than another that hopes for the downfall of the United States?
Ooh, so this is a really great question too. So it's common, our culture, especially our entertainment culture, seems to make this narrative that people want to see the downfall of the United States. No country out there wants to see the United States crumble. Russians don't want that. Chinese don't want that. North Koreans don't want that. Nobody wants to see the United States implode, because the United States is a gigantic money pit. Like, we're just churning out the cash that drives the global economy, right? And whether we like it or not, Americans are some of the most spoiled, best paid, least informed individuals that are part of the global economy. And I say that not as like I'm trying to make anybody angry, but I think if we all really reflect on our country as a whole, we understand that when we invest in, fidget spinners and plastic toys and low grade shoes that we buy, from Walmart, we're not really trying to be really intelligent, frugal buyers. We're just trying to be consumers. And that consumer activity is really what drives everyone else in the world. It's what makes for everybody else's paycheck. So they don't want to see the US collapse. What countries want to see is a new shift in global power. They want to see a new superpower. The United States can sit in the second seat or the third highest chair at the table, right? But what happens when the US is no longer the top dog, and US military is no longer the best and biggest and most strongest funded military in the world? What happens when the US president doesn't get what he wants? Instead, he just has to throw in a vote and be part of a panel that gets to decide in the end, right? You've seen this already in NATO and in the UN from the German chancellor, who wants to see Germany become the new largest military in Europe, so that they don't have to do what the United States says anymore. And you see it in France when President Macron visits, known hostile threats to the West, and says, and builds stronger relationships with them. It's not because these country leaders are underinformed or are not skilled politicians. It's because they are realizing that it might be in their country's best interest if the United States wasn't so powerful. And that's a problem for us, because we've built our reputation since the end of World War II on the world trusting us to be the best and strongest country in the world. And now we have let that reputation dwindle. And we're stuck in this position now where we have a vying contender in the East who's trying to replace us. And if we're not careful, we may very well find ourselves in second place.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. I've tried to do fair reporting about the courageous fighting of the Ukraine military, but also let the data guide us that Russia does seem to be winning, as far as, unfortunately, more Ukrainians dying than Russians. But could you help my viewers understand how the United States is really supporting Ukraine? Because putting on yellow and blue pins in Congress doesn't do anything. Putting a yellow and blue flag in front of your yard doesn't do anything. We feel like the United States is there doing a lot, but at the end of the day, isn't it mostly us allowing Ukraine to go into significant amounts of debt? Because they're really just borrowing money and leasing equipment from us, like what England did during World War II. Are we really supporting them in the way that the media leads the American people to believe, or is Ukraine just in tons of debt to the United States now?
Yeah, you're portraying this exactly right, Stephen, right? The United States is supporting Ukraine in much the same way that a bank supports your mortgage, right? You can't afford the house you live in, so you go to a bank, maybe several banks, and you apply for mortgages. And then some banks say no, and then hopefully one bank says yes. And then they put an interest rate on your mortgage. So they do back you buying your house, but they hold the lease. And on top of that, they then advertise about how they're there helping the little guy own his first house. right? That's exactly what the United States is doing in Ukraine right now. That's the definition of a proxy war. And proxy war is really the typical type of war that we've been seeing since about 2011, when Syria became a war zone, an active war zone. You are seeing the United States support Ukraine with advanced technology, with weapons, with intelligence, giving them an asymmetric military advantage in terms of weaponry and technology, but not giving them troops on the ground, not giving them some specific military support that would actually demonstrate a formal alliance. And to your point also, Stephen, you're right. Ukraine, whether or not Ukraine is losing more soldiers or Russia is losing more soldiers on any given day, Ukraine is a smaller country with a much smaller standing army. And Putin understands that even if he's losing today, if he can just make this war a long-term war, Russia will eventually win. Syria and Assad is a fantastic testbed to kind of show what's happening right now in Ukraine, right? In 2011, Bashar al-Assad was deemed a dictator and an authoritarian and a cruel warmonger, and the whole world turned against him, from the Arab world to the Western world and Europe. And now in 2023, he's still the dictator in Syria. He has returned to the Arab League. He has essentially been declared through the eyes of the world the winner and rightful ruler now of Syria, even though the war is still technically not over. You're seeing what happens, and it's a gigantic win for the authoritarian rulers of the world to see Bashar al-Assad return to the Arab League. And that's exactly what Putin is gambling on. He's gambling on the West and democracies of the world growing tired and burdened and having to focus on more domestic policy issues, and eventually just giving up on Ukraine. And he knows that Ukraine is fighting a war with diminishing resources, right? Diminishing resources. It's not going to keep getting weapons. It can't just suddenly recreate new soldiers. And there's not enough formal support from outside of Ukraine putting boots on the ground to ever compete with the 2 million plus person standing army in Russia.
Yeah, and I don't see NATO ever wanting to really put boots on the ground. Everybody wants to know when and how this will end. I don't unless there's a false flag that genuinely pulls Poland or somebody in Europe in. I think the other G7 nations, they'll just let this thing fizzle out because they don't want to really fight Russia.
Yep.
And so, okay, thank you for that.
And the most likely outcome that we're going to see here, Stephen, is something very similar to what we saw in the Korean War. We'll see some sort of demarcation zone, and then land that permanently belongs to Russia and land that remains under the control of Ukraine. But Ukraine is never going to be allowed to join NATO. It's never going to be returned to its original borders. And I think that's why you see Zelensky fighting so hard to push back the Russians and regain the original territories that were lost in 2004, because I think he understands that if he doesn't win, if he doesn't fight and win, if this counteroffensive isn't successful, it's like not paying your bills, like not paying your mortgage on time. Eventually, the bank's going to come due and say, hey, either you're bankrupt or you're going to pay us back. And Zelensky feels that. And that's why he works as hard as he does, messaging things the way he does, traveling the way he does, drumming up support, even though the world is kind of tired of watching what's happening in Europe, because it doesn't really affect most of the Western world, at least not the United States. We are so outside of the sphere of influence of Russia and Ukraine that it's hard for us to even keep track or take an interest in what's going on over there.
Yeah. Okay, let's come back domestically. You had mentioned on another podcast that there are, help me make sure I understood this, that there are over 100,000 undercover agents in the United States that we've probably interacted with them, not even knowing, at Disneyland or the grocery store or the bank or what. Can you give a little bit more insight? Because I heard that and was like, wait, what?
Yeah, so that's an unclassified number that helps to give a little bit of perspective to just how common espionage really is, right? We mentioned earlier, every developing and first world country in the world has an intelligence service, and every one of those countries has a foreign intelligence service. And guess who the wealthiest, richest, most powerful country in the world is? The United States. So essentially, if you take those 163-ish nations, they all have an interest in deploying people to the United States specifically so that they can collect intelligence about not just the United States, but again, about each other from within the United States. I was just in New York yesterday, and I had a chance to go walk past the UN building. And when you walk past the UN building, you realize that even though you're in New York, you're really in a part of New York that's dedicated to the United Nations. So if you're a spy for Turkey and you are focused on UN issues, the best place to be is in New York, in the middle of the UN, in some kind of cover capacity there, right? But if you're a spy from Turkey and you want to be studying finance, you want to be in a different part of New York, in the financial district of New York. So now Turkey has a reason to put at least 2 different undercover spies just in New York. Now imagine doing that in LA, Chicago, Miami, Dallas, Houston, and the list goes on and on. And that's just one country. Nigeria is doing the same thing. South Africa is doing the same thing. Russia, China, Japan, South Korea, they all have an interest in putting their own foreign intelligence undercover officers here to work inside the United States. And once again, now I'm just talking about people who are targeting military intelligence and political intelligence. But remember, we said there's 5 different types of intelligence. So all of your corporate spies, your industrial spies, and your economic spies are coming in a different capacity to a different place for a different reason. And all of a sudden you see just a flood of undercover people here in the United States. And 100,000 may sound like a lot, but think about the fact that there's 300 million Americans, 220 million adult Americans. It's easy to lose track of 100,000 people.
Yeah. Okay, so my mind was blown when I thought it was 100,000 Americans undercover. Now you're telling me it's foreign nations that are undercover in, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Wow.
inside the United States, you probably only have about 10,000 Americans undercover. And those Americans who are undercover combating those 100,000 people who are undercover from abroad.
Oh
so you can see how it's a little bit of a lopsided battle.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm glad I caught that. And then I'm glad I got you to tell that and to clarify. You also mentioned on that same podcast that the country that's most prolific with getting spies is actually the country of China, and that just based on their social construct, they've basically made every Chinese citizen into a spy. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's not a formal thing. It's not like they've been trained in espionage. But what happens is culturally, Chinese identify as Chinese first, right? Now, most Caucasian Americans have never really considered themselves an ethnic mix, right? But most Latinos would say that they are Mexican American or Venezuelan American, right? African Americans call themselves African American, right? The same thing is true with Chinese, ethnically Chinese. They're Sino something, right? Sino-Americans, Sino-Vietnamese, Sino-Russian, but they're always Sino, which is the word for Chinese. They're always Chinese first ethnically. So because of that, there's a certain loyalty to their cultural construct, to the motherland, to the kingdom, the central kingdom, right, back at home. So one of the big arguments that I hear from people when they talk about China is going to have this massive downfall because of its lack of population, the reason that the whole population decline argument is null and void for the Chinese is because it only accounts for the Chinese inside of China. The truth is that if Xi Jinping put out a memo calling the Chinese back from all over the world saying, hey, your children and your grandchildren are needed back here in the motherland to repopulate and rejuvenate and guarantee us the next 200 years of growth. I mean, 50% of the Chinese who have immigrated would go right back to China because they're being called back culturally. And now all of a sudden, China is going to be flooded with well-educated, wealthy, middle-aged, and young Chinese people, Chinese Vietnamese, Sino-Vietnamese, Sino-Americans, Sino-Turks, Sino-British, who have all come back because they've been called back. That cultural identity is what makes it so they're all also actively they're willing to be active informants, helping the Chinese to continue to grow and secure their own culture. It's very different than your American expat, because your American expat usually wants to leave America and kind of never come back, right? They're going to Grenada, or they're going to Belize, or they're going to Mexico, or they're going to Portugal because they want to disappear and they're angry about still having to pay taxes, and they don't really want to come back to the United States. It's a very different culture whenever you're coming from a place like China.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Joe Biden happens to be president today. I don't know what will happen in 2024, but Tell us a little bit about every morning the president of the United States, whoever he or she is, gets a security detail or briefing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then is Joe Biden actually reading that thing, or is somebody reading it for him and then giving him like a verbal cliff notes of what's going on in the country each morning?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what you're referencing right now is called the President's Daily Brief, or the PDB. And the President's Daily Brief is created every morning by a team of analysts at CIA. It's put into a very fancy leather binder, and it's presented to the president every morning. But you're also right that no, the president does not read the PDB. The PDB is not a security report. It is a prioritized intelligence report, where whatever issues are of most importance to the president as defined by the president get the first few pages. And then all the other pages are all of the other kind of top hitting news, if you will, for all of the other countries that are lower priority countries. And further to your point, the president doesn't read about everything, but he also oftentimes doesn't read even the first few pages, because there is a dedicated briefer from CIA whose job it is to brief the PDB to the president. So some presidents will read it, and some presidents will read about certain countries. Obama had a reputation for always taking time to selectively read about the countries he was the most personally interested in. Sometimes those were top priority countries. Sometimes those were countries that he thought there might be something where there might be a priority in the future. President Trump had a very different relationship with CIA. He didn't really fund or rely on CIA because it worked against him for most of his presidency, which makes sense. It's again, the CIA serves at the behest of the executive. And the executive didn't really care to partner with CIA. So those 4 years with Trump in office were a very different relationship than we've seen in a long time. But with President Biden, yeah, he's relying on a briefer to tell him about the countries that he's identified as the most relevant to him. And then whether or not he also takes the time to kind of peruse through that PDB on his own is not known to me.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Now, in another podcast, you had kind of compared the intelligence as like being a product, right? And so when you say Trump was not interested in that, basically it was like a product that he was like, nah, I'll get my product somewhere else, whether that was Fox News or whatever. But and then you're saying like Obama, he would selectively pick out parts of the product that he liked on a daily basis. Okay, just making sure that people understand how that all works. Okay, just a couple more questions, and then I know your time is very valuable. You're just getting back to your wife, but there's been rumors, and some of this has been somewhat confirmed. But have you ever seen or known about CIA, FBI, NSA planting operatives within the mainstream media in order to have sway or control over what the American public is being educated on through the news?
That not only have I never heard of that in my own experience, but that would violate a number of the authorities that have been given to those organizations and go against the promises and the oath that we take going in. Now, I understand that there are always going to be people who believe that conspiratorially that's happening. I would actually push back and say most likely what's happening is that former officers are leaving their respective posts to then join mainstream media to become part of media reporting instead of part of intelligence reporting. That's actually a far more common transition than people realize. And it's not because those former officers are trying to sway the American public. It's because oftentimes to become an intelligence officer, the determination is paired with a heavy sense of nationalism and ideology. So you have a CIA, an NSA, and FBI that's populated by very intelligent, nationalistic, ideological individuals. And then inside the bureaucracy of government, they try to actually take out that ideology and focus more on the professionalization of intelligence collection. Well, when you're very ideological and you don't want to get rid of that ideology, sometimes it's easier to just resign and then take your ideology to an ideological news source or media source that is happy to welcome you with open arms. That happens quite often, and I would believe that before I would believe that the CIA or NSA is undercover planting, individuals who are shaping the media. That goes against anything I've experienced.
Okay, so like just two examples, maybe on like a Democrat side, John Brennan, former CIA, ends up as a talking head on CNN, where Kayleigh McEnany leaves the Trump White House and ends up on Fox News as a talking head. Is that a good example?
Exactly. That's an excellent example. And you'll be able to list probably 5 people on each hand who have done exactly that, right? Former CIA officers who have become pundits on one mainstream media platform or another, pushing the agenda, pushing the narrative of that platform, not because they've been assigned there, but because they just have a political leaning that's complementary to that news channel.
Okay, gotcha. I don't watch Fox News, but I remember waking up one day and being like, "Oh, wait a minute, Larry Kudlow and Kayleigh McEnany now work for Fox News." Like, so okay, so that makes more sense where they would be picked up or hired later, and bring some of that. Okay, last one. This one's just kind of fun. Right now, it's big in the news. This military whistleblower talking about aliens and UFOs, and the United States military and government having UFO technology from non-human craft and non-human, basically, entities, non-human aliens. Do you think there's anything to this whistleblower, or is this a giant distraction that the news kicks up every now and then? I'm having a hard time reading between the lines. What are your thoughts on this story?
Yeah, anytime I hear about whistleblowers who are blowing whistles on UFO technology and alien spacecraft, where my mind goes is that they're not lying. They honestly believe that what they're saying is true, but that doesn't mean they're of sound mind to be making that assessment, right? I've seen some absolutely incredible technology, just mind-blowing stuff, and stuff that's so out of this world, stuff that we've used in the field. It seems like the thing of science fiction. Stephen, you remember watching Charlie's Angels when you were a kid. And how did Charlie reach out to the angels? Through a video phone call, right? That seemed like science fiction for a long time. Now it happens everywhere we go. Now there's competing technologies, right? Is it FaceTime? Is it Zoom? Is it Riverside? Who is it that's actually providing the video interface right now? So it's not uncommon for the things that used to be science fiction to become reality. But what ends up happening is sometimes there are people who just they want to believe so badly that they'll stretch and say that something they saw maybe belonged to something they didn't know. Here's the truth is, if there was any kind of highly classified U.S. government efforts to protect alien spacecraft or alien technology, that would be so deeply classified, so heavily controlled, the information itself, that they wouldn't ever let those people would be signed to a lifetime secrecy agreement that basically made it so that if they blew a whistle or if they made it public, they would immediately be arrested and put in jail. And flip side to that, to incentivize them against ever doing that, they would basically be guaranteed an entire comfortable life on a desert, on a paradise island somewhere in the South Pacific for just pretending that they didn't know anything, right? That's the real way intelligence works. You incentivize people to keep a secret. You don't threaten them to keep a secret. So I'm highly skeptical of any whistleblowers who say that they had access to alien technology or programs with alien technology, because that kind of thing would be so difficult to keep quiet, and the US government would have it so heavily compartmentalized that they would be either liable for the rest of their lives or rewarded by being scurried away to some place where they could never talk to a human being ever again.
Gotcha. Okay. Tell us a little bit about Everyday Spy, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks very much. So Everyday Spy is my company. My personal mission is to bring spy skills and spy tools that I used at CIA that gave me an unfair advantage in business and personal security and personal relationships. And my goal is to bring those spies to everyday people, to give them the same unfair advantage. So I've been working with everyone from ultra high net worth to entrepreneurs to career professionals and executive staff, giving them a different frame of mind, a different frame of reference, some different and more tactical tools like what CIA uses, so that they can get the results they want in a shorter, faster, more reliable process. And that's what Everyday Spy is. And you can find me and you can find my my product line, to go back to your comments about products, Stephen, at everydayspy.com, or if you follow social media, you'll find me everywhere at everydayspy.
Okay, great. Everydayspy.com. Andrew Bustamante, thank you so much for coming on. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes so that people can go and learn more. This has been a very fascinating. I hope I didn't jump around too much, but I only got to half the questions I wanted to ask, so we'll have to have you back on. But thank you so much for your insight and information today.
My pleasure, Stephen. Thanks for having me on, man.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.